Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring the fascinating, high-stakes, and honestly kind of brutal underwater world of freshwater crayfish. You might call them crawdads, mudbugs, or even tiny freshwater lobsters, but the truth is, the life of a crayfish is an absolute gauntlet. From the exact moment they hatch, these incredibly resilient creatures face just a constant battle against their environment, devastating diseases, and even their own siblings.
Take a look at this guy. Meet Asticus leptodactylus. Looks heavily armored, right? Built like an absolute tank and ready to take on the world. But beneath that hard exoskeleton is actually a highly sensitive organism. Their survival hinges on this really precarious balance of internal biology and external water conditions. So in this explainer, we're going to completely decode the biological secrets of their survival. Okay, let's dive into this. Why dedicate an entire explainer to the humble mudbug? Well, it turns out they are what biologists call ecosystem engineers. They process organic matter, they modify sediments, and they serve as this absolutely crucial food source for a huge variety of predators. But more importantly, and I found this incredibly fascinating, they're key bioindicators. They are extremely sensitive to pollution, which means the presence, or absence, of crayfish tells us exactly how healthy our continental waters really are. When the crayfish disappear, it's a massive red flag for the entire ecosystem.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the 4 life stages, the perils of molting, essential water parameters, drought and hypoxia, and finally, the devastating crayfish plague.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the 4 life stages. We begin with a journey from birth to adulthood that seriously tests their resilience at every single step. Now, while there are over 640 species of crayfish worldwide, they all pretty much share this core life cycle. It starts with eggs, and just a quick note, male crayfish offer absolutely zero parental care. It is entirely up to the female. She holds hundreds of developing eggs in a brood pouch right under her abdomen for about 3 to 8 weeks, and she uses these little appendages called pleopods to constantly fan the eggs, keeping them clean and highly oxygenated. Now, unlike a lot of marine crustaceans, crayfish don't have a free-floating planktonic larval stage. When they hatch, they emerge as hatchlings, which are just these tiny, perfectly formed, microscopic copies of the adults. From there, they enter the juvenile stage of rapid growth, eventually hitting sexual maturity somewhere between 3 and 5 years of age.
But getting to that adult stage? Terrifying. In the underwater world, being small is a massive danger. You're basically prey to birds, fish, turtles, practically anything with a mouth. But you know what their most immediate threat is? Their own family. Crayfish are opportunistic omnivores, and in that juvenile stage, they need a massive amount of nutrition to fuel their rapid growth. If there's a lack of food, or if they're stuck in too small a space, this brutal instinct just kicks in: rapid cannibalism. Baby crayfish literally have to eat constantly, or they risk being eaten by their own siblings. Talk about high stakes, right?
Moving right along to Section 2, the perils of molting.
Now, all that rapid growth brings us to what is arguably the most dangerous, stressful, and, fascinating part of a crayfish's life: the molting process. Because their exoskeleton is rigid and inflexible, the literal only way a crayfish can grow is by completely shedding its old shell. Molting is this highly complex, asynchronous cycle broken down into 4 distinct stages. It starts with proigdisis, where the crayfish actually absorbs calcium from its old shell. Then comes ecdysis, the physical shedding, which can last anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours. To crack out of that old armor, the crayfish ingests a massive amount of water and literally stops urinating. This builds up intense internal hydrostic pressure until the old shell just snaps, right at the breaking point between the carapace and the abdomen. Then they have to physically drag their entire body, delicate antenna, legs, the whole shebang, out of the old casing. After that is metaecdysis, a period of extreme vulnerability as the new shell hardens, followed by anecdysis, which is the long resting phase between molts.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how they manage their calcium during this whole process. Calcium is quite literally life or death for a crayfish. During that pre-molt phase, as they're breaking down their old shell, they actually store the extracted calcium right inside their stomachs in the form of these hard little discs called gastroliths, or calcium stones. The exact moment they shed their old shell, these stones are rapidly digested, flushing a huge dose of calcium straight into their bloodstream. This lets them instantly remineralize their mouthparts so they can eat, and their legs so they can run and hide. It is just a brilliantly evolved internal recycling system. But hey, even with those amazing gastroliths, the immediate post-molt phase, metaecdysis, is just a nightmare. Their new shell is paper-thin and entirely soft. They are essentially immobilized, way too weak to defend themselves, and they look like an easy, bite-sized meal to any passing predator. In fact, they're so incredibly fragile during this window that even tiny, peaceful dwarf shrimp have been known to accidentally kill a molting crayfish just by picking at it. This is exactly why having abundant hiding places, like rocks, driftwood, or if they're in captivity, PVC pipes, is absolutely non-negotiable for their survival.
Which brings us to Section 3, Calcium and Water Parameters.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact parameters these guys need to survive. A crayfish's internal success is entirely dictated by the specific aquatic chemistry of the water they live in. They thrive in temperatures between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. They absolutely need dissolved oxygen levels above 3 milligrams per liter. But take a look at the pH and water hardness. They prefer a pH between 6.5 and 8.5, and a general hardness of 6 to 12. Why? Because that general hardness provides the dissolved calcium and magnesium they absorb directly from the water to harden those new shells. If the pH drops below 6.0, the water gets too acidic. The calcium carbonate in their shells actually reacts with the acid, making their exoskeleton way too flexible and mushy. When it comes time to molt, they literally can't generate enough pressure to crack the shell, which tragically traps them inside to die.
There's also a really deadly interplay between temperature and oxygen here. Crayfish are poikilothermic, meaning their body temperature and metabolic rate are controlled completely by the surrounding water. As summer temperatures rise, a crayfish's metabolism naturally speeds up, which means they need way more oxygen to survive. But there's a cruel irony in physics here. Warmer water physically holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. So as the water heats up, a crayfish's asphyxiation point actually increases. They need more oxygen at the exact moment the environment is providing less. This puts rapidly growing juveniles at an incredibly high risk of suffocating during the peak of summer heat.
All right, Section 4, Drought and Hypoxia. So what happens when that water environment doesn't just get hot, but completely dries up? When water levels recede, crayfish don't just sit around waiting to dry out, they literally engineer their survival. They start digging these vertical burrows, sometimes going up to 32 centimeters deep, desperately chasing the receding water table. To stop the vital moisture from escaping, they construct these elaborate dirt plugs or chimneys at the surface, sealing themselves inside a stable, humid, subterranean bunker. But it's a total race against time and energy. Research actually shows that an individual's survival relies heavily on their initial energy state before the drought. Well-fed, high-energy crayfish can dig much deeper, more robust burrows, giving them a significantly better chance of outlasting a severe dry spell. But surviving a drought as an adult, that's really only half the battle. Studies simulating drought conditions reveal a pretty grim reality for the population as a whole. While adult survival rates might hold somewhat steady down in those deep burrows, reproductive success is deeply, deeply compromised long before the adults die off. Restricted precipitation leads to a devastating 62% reduction in successful spawning. The presence of freestanding water is just absolutely essential for egg development and juvenile survival. So a drought might spare the adults, but it effectively wipes out the entire next generation. And that brings us to the most dramatic part of our explainer. Section 5, the Crayfish Plague.
As if cannibalism, exhausting molts, acidic water, and severe droughts weren't enough, right? We now turn to a catastrophic global disease that is literally wiping out native populations. It's known as the crayfish plague, caused by the pathogen Aphanomyces astachi. This is an oomycete, essentially a water mold naturally carried by North American crayfish species that have evolved a resistance to it. But when these resistant carriers are introduced to Europe and other parts of the world, they unleash this plague on native species that have absolutely zero immune defense. And the mechanics of this infection? They are incredibly grim. The pathogen releases free-swimming zoospores that are chemically attracted to the crayfish's shell. They attach, they germinate, they penetrate the armor, and they infiltrate the internal organs in just a matter of days. The symptoms are honestly heartbreaking. Normally nocturnal, shy crayfish stagger out into broad daylight, completely losing their coordination and that natural tail flip escape reflex, eventually just rolling onto their backs, totally paralyzed.
So the crucial point is this number right here, 100%. That is the standard mortality rate when the crayfish plague reaches a naive, susceptible population. It just completely bypasses all of their natural defenses. In summer temperatures, this infection can spread so incredibly fast that an over 50-kilometer stretch of river can lose every single one of its crayfish in less than 21 days. The bottoms of the waterways simply become covered in dead and dying crustaceans. It's absolutely devastating. Let's wrap things up with our final section, synthesis and survival.
So this brings us to a vital synthesis of everything we've looked at today. The freshwater crayfish is a massive paradox. On one hand, they are these robust, adaptable survivors, totally capable of regrowing lost limbs, engineering subterranean bunkers to survive brutal droughts, and processing vast amounts of organic material to keep ecosystems running. But on the other hand, they are tragically fragile. They're tied to the absolute necessity of calcium, they're highly vulnerable during their paper-thin post-molt phase, and they are entirely defenseless against foreign pathogens. Which leaves us with a really critical thought to end on. Crayfish are the prime players of freshwater environments. Their health is literally synonymous with the health of the water itself. As these master engineers face increasing threats from habitat loss, agricultural chemical runoff, and 100% fatal plagues, we have to ask ourselves, what does the decline of the crayfish mean for the future health of our continental waters? If the engineers disappear, what happens to the rest of the ecosystem? It's a question we really can't afford to ignore. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.